Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a weekly 30-minute radio show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. I'll be speaking with Sarah Wenzel-Fisher, director of the Quivira Coalition, a Santa Fe-based nonprofit organization devoted to healthy soil, biodiversity, and resilience on Western working landscapes. They foster ecological, economic, and social health through education, innovation, and collaboration. And so we'll find out more about Sarah and Quivira in just a moment. But first, a few short announcements. Last week, I interviewed Tina Cordova, a longtime leader of the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium. I'd heard Tina speak many times, and she's pretty powerful, and her topic is pretty powerful. And so while the information she conveyed will probably sadden you and anger you, well, it should. Hopefully it will also inspire you. And as she is so good at doing this, I really highly recommend that you check out the recording of that interview. The week before that, I spoke with Kelly O'Donnell, a New Mexico economist from UNM, who once was on the staff of New Mexico Voices for Children, one of our strongest allies. And just recently, she had chimed in on a New Mexico political report on the need to diversify our economy, and her ideas reflected in the article were so aligned with retakes that I had her on the show. So that also is a worthwhile interview. You can get those interviews with Kelly and Tina, along with all our shows, including today's discussion with Sarah Wenzel-Fisher, by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, click on the Actions and Events menu, and scroll to Retake Conversations, and they'll all be listed there. I'll publish the interview with Sarah on Saturday morning, probably about the time it airs. So you may even be able to listen to it before it airs. They don't like that at KSFR. And before we get started with Sarah, as is our practice, I want to acknowledge that we are conducting this radio show on stolen Tewa land, and to thank our Tewa neighbors for their great stewardship of the land for many, many centuries. We need to learn from them, or we have no hope. Let's get started. Welcome to the show, Sarah.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, I always like to let our guests introduce themselves, since they know themselves better than I do. And so if you could just share with us how you got involved in the Quivira program and just in sustainable food and agriculture in general.
Sure, happy to. Thanks so much for having me. And also thank you for your land acknowledgement. That was lovely. I'm here today at a place called Polk's Folly Farm. I'm working from home. I'm not at the Quivira office. And this particular farm is on the traditional homelands of the Tano and Tiwa people. We're sort of adjacent to what was the Paco community. And as you also said, there's been a lot of harm done here in the Southwest to tribal people, and we have so much to learn and so much to be grateful for in terms of their long-term land stewardship. So I'll start with that before I start talking about myself. I've lived in New Mexico since the mid-90s, and I think for over a decade now have been involved in food and farming. I am somebody who I think I've always been passionate about food, and I've always been passionate about Western working lands. I grew up in Western South Dakota, and then have been in New Mexico basically since the mid-90s. And I got involved in food and farming in graduate school at UNM. I sort of started my graduate school path thinking that I wanted to study art and be a creative person in the world. And most of the work that I was doing revolved around organizing people and bringing them together to have a conversation about place. So rather than landing in a fine art program, I landed in a community and regional planning program. And as I learned more about what that field meant, I got really fascinated with the fact that there was not, at that particular time, a lot of conversation happening about how we were planning our food and agriculture systems. So I decided to do my graduate research on economic viability of direct retail market, direct market farms in the Middle Rio Grande Valley. I interviewed about 40 farmers up and down the Rio Grande Valley and asked them questions about sort of how they made it work. And that sort of led me into the work that I do today. I did a lot of other things in between that graduate work and being the director at Quivira. In addition to that graduate work, I worked at La Montanita Co-op for a while in their membership program and did a lot of the community programming there with Robin Seidel. I worked with the Rio Grande Agricultural Land Trust on their board for a number of years. I was the editor of Edible Magazine for about 7 years. And I also worked for the National Young Farmers Coalition as an organizer here in New Mexico. And all of those things eventually led me to the Quivira Coalition. I started with Quivira helping with their agricultural apprenticeship program. It's called the New Agrarian Program. So we place young people who are interested in agricultural careers, but maybe don't have connections through family or some other pathway to sort of access that kind of knowledge. So we place those types of folks who are interested in a career in agriculture with folks who are practicing regenerative agriculture. So that was my entry point to Quivira. But I have now been there for 5 years as the director. And we have a variety of programs beyond our apprenticeship program. We also have something called the Carbon Ranch Initiative, where we're focused on really understanding what is healthy soil and how we can best support stewards of working lands to focus on healthy soil as a mode of climate resilience and really doing a better job with our water resources. We also have an education and outreach program, which involves everything from a podcast called Down to Earth to a great array of technical guides to an annual conference we put on every year called Regenerate, which I will invite you to later.
Hey, why don't you do that now so we get
Okay.
it in on the radio show?
Great. So Regenerate is a conference that we put on with Holistic Management International and the American Grass-Fed Association. This year, we're going to have a hybrid conference. So we will have in-person activities as well as virtual activities based on whether or not people are able to travel, what's happening with the pandemic at that moment, and a number of other factors. But the theme this year is weaving water, land, and people. We're really excited to have a little bit of a focus on water this year at our convening. The conference will be 3 parts. We'll have some field days in September. There will be at least 2 here in New Mexico that folks can attend. We'll have a week of virtual workshops in October, ranging from something called the Good Meat Breakdown, which is a project helping to educate consumers about whole animal utilization, to mental health of farmers and ranchers, to carbon ranching and sort of everything in between. And then we'll wrap up with a 2-day actual in-person conference in Albuquerque that will also be broadcast virtually. So regenerateconference.com is a website that you can find more information. You also can find more information at quiviracoalition.org/regenerate. I invite you all to participate. Registration, I think, will be open in the next 2 weeks. So
and Retake Our Democracy will post that as soon as I get my hot little hands on it. I have to ask this. This wasn't one of the questions I shared with you, but you were in charge of Edible for a while, or at least you had a role there. Were you responsible for the green chili cheeseburger smackdown competition?
I cannot claim any responsibility for the green chili cheeseburger smackdown. but it's a fantastic event. So I was the editor, the publisher. She is Stephanie Cameron, and her husband, Walt Cameron. They are the a powerhouse behind Edible Magazine, and they also are the folks who produce all of the fabulous edible events.
Oh, well, I'm a huge fan and was so disappointed that that went down for a couple of years, but I already have my VIP tickets for September 11th, folks.
I'm a big fan also, so maybe I'll
All
see
right,
you there.
all right, now let's dig in. I was already pretty familiar with Quivira because my wife Roxanne and I took Climate Masters class, and that was right next door. And I think someone even from Quivira spoke, but that was like 8 years ago or so. But I had been under the impression your focus is on grazing rather than on sustainable farming. Can you tell us a bit about your work in sustainable grazing and how it is how it not only produces better meat, but how it can restore the land? And then we'll get on to other agricultural stuff in a bit.
Sure, absolutely. And I will say, the work at Quivira is pretty diverse. Our mission statement says that we are fostering resilience on arid working lands, and arid working lands might be sustainable farming, it might be grazing and ranching, it might be agritourism. There's a lot of ways in which people make a living from the land, and we try to take a holistic approach to that. But here in New Mexico, often that means that there is livestock involved because we are an arid place. And so what food production our landscapes can support is often cattle or some other type of livestock. And I will just say that it's a hard place to grow food, New Mexico. But it also is a place can be, totally abundant and beautiful. And sustainable grazing means a lot of different things to a lot of different folks. And I guess what I will say is that it's very context specific. But I think there are some underlying principles which are about, really tuning into what is the biology that's supporting your livestock. So paying attention to the plants, making sure that animals are moving frequently enough that plants aren't being overgrazed, that there's a good reciprocal relationship between those animals and the grassland ecology that's there. And sort of thinking whole big picture also. So, sustainable grazing, I think maybe another piece to throw in there is sort of about grass-fed livestock and grass finished. So a lot of producers in New Mexico operate on something called like a cow-calf system, where they're raising animals that then get sent someplace else to be finished. And another hat that I wear is I'm on the board of a group called the Southwest Grass-Fed Livestock Alliance. So working with producers to understand how they can be finishing livestock on grass. I think there are an increasing number of studies that show that grass-fed and grass-finished livestock have, say, like higher omegas in their fats. They also have had probably a lot more exercise out on the landscape. And all of those things can contribute to a meat that may be healthier nutritionally, maybe more nutritionally dense. But I think that there's another piece, which is, there are folks who are figuring out how to raise protein in a way that has a lower carbon footprint. So, the production of beef is complex. And, if you're not somebody who does that, you may not realize all of the steps that are involved. And so, if you're raising, if you have a cow-calf operation here in New Mexico, and then the calves are raised up and then shipped off someplace else to be potentially finished in another fashion, maybe finished in a grain feeding lot, how much carbon emission is associated with that protein production can vary a lot.
Right.
But, we have operators that we're working with who are raising animals in a fashion where like the only time that they're getting in a vehicle, getting put in a trailer is the moment that they are being shipped off to be processed. So, I think you're asking a complex question there. So I'm just kind of riffing on
Right.
it a little bit.
Let
But
me
it
ask
is
you
definitely
this. Let me ask you this. I've heard that there are folks, and I'm imagining you might be one of them, who have been advocating for being able to develop the capacity to process the meat here in New Mexico. Is that impossible, impossible dream, or is it a realistic goal?
So that's a great question. So processing in New Mexico is extremely limited. We have on any given day of the week only a handful of plants that have USDA certification. Um, if you're raising meat for your family or you're selling like a whole or a half animal to a neighbor or a friend directly, as the rules are right now, you can go to what's called a custom processor, and we have a lot more custom processors. Those are the places where folks might bring an animal that they've hunted to be broken down. But if somebody's making a living and they want to be able to sell their cuts at a farmer's market or sell that meat to a grocery store to then resell it, it has to go through a USDA certified plant. And we have very few of those in the state. And they're sort of few and far between. Not all of them have the capacity to process all types of animals. So for example, I live on a hog farm and there are, I think, 2 plants in New Mexico that have USDA certification that can actually slaughter those animals. And then only one of those plants has the capacity to then cut it up and put it in packages, has the right certification to cut it up and put it in packages and sell it. So I think there's a huge need for more processing in the state, and processing that is geared towards producers who are not raising thousands of animals, but maybe like tens to 100 animals, and are thinking about selling that meat either direct retail to a consumer or in a small wholesale market. They're not selling into big grocery retail chains or to a distributor like Cisco. They're maybe selling to La Montanita Co-op.
Right.
So
Right. Okay, well, we've gotten through 2 questions in 18 minutes, so I'm going to try and maybe pick and choose a little bit to make sure that the radio audience gets the good questions, which I tend to save for last. So I do want to talk a little bit about sustainable agricultural and how their role in creating better local food systems. We've seen in the with COVID that our food processing and our access to food is so little of it comes from New Mexico. What can we do about that, and what are you doing about it?
That is a wonderful question, and one I love to talk about. Local food, I think that, I don't know what the statistic today, right now in this moment is, but it's something like, we're consuming less than 2% of food that is made
Right.
produced in New Mexico. And there are all kinds of sustainability issues around that, as well as, opportunities, I think, economically to support activities that are happening here in the state. So I think your question was about sort of how do we improve local and regional food systems?
Yeah.
Um, it's a complex question. You had a policy question on your list for me, and I will say that there are a lot of people who are thinking deeply about this, and it's extremely complex, but kudos to Melanie Stansberry for helping to get through some funding to create a food, hunger, and farm steering committee at the state level. This group is headed up by a gal named Kendall Chavez, who I think is brilliant, and she has convened a large number of stakeholders who are doing work from hunger relief efforts all the way to local food systems work, trying to think through what are the critical pieces of infrastructure and support that we need to have in place where we're addressing both because they're related, right? And I think some of the things that need to happen, infrastructure is huge. So you asked the question about processing. We have very limited processing facilities for meat, but other types of processing also. So co-packing facilities, canneries, the types of establishments that help us take food from where it's being grown in the ground, add value to it, add shelf life to it, to make things available that way. Distribution is another. La Montanita Co-op, as you mentioned, has a great distribution center where they're aggregating local food and then selling it to restaurants, other grocery stores around the state. But they're one of very few entities that's doing that kind of distribution. So, those are some places where I think there are opportunities for us as a state to invest, to help support local food, as well as address some of the hunger issues that we have here in the state. And I think sort of on an individual level, really just being tuned in and committed to supporting local producers. Seek out folks who are producing local food, and to the degree that you are able, incorporate it into part of your daily, weekly meal routine.
Mhm.
There are a ton of great CSAs. A number of grocery stores will carry local food, but you have to seek it out and you've got to ask
Right.
questions about it. Farmers markets are fantastic. And I think there are other places where local food is less visible. So one example I'll give is Valencia Mill. So there is a mill in Valencia that has been in operation for, I think, almost 40 years now. They are processing wheat that is grown by NAPI, which is Navajo Agricultural Products Incorporated, I believe. So it's grains that are grown, they're not organic, but grains that are grown in the region, then processed in the region. They have amazing flour, and that may be a thing where people think, well, I can't actually source this locally, but you can. Or things like green chili, but even there, that's a complex question, because it's like, how do you know if it's being grown in Mexico or in New Mexico? But I think being a conscientious consumer is like the number one thing that folks can do. And then I think the second thing that folks can do is really tune into what's happening at the state level with these efforts, and be aware of this Food, Hunger, and Farm Steering Committee, as well as talk to your elected officials about if it's important to you, whether it's important, and why it's important to you. So,
Well, that's really helpful, and I'm definitely going to follow up with maybe ask for an introduction to Kendall, talk to her, because this is one of the big issues Retake is taking on in 2021. Another one is water preservation policy. Before we get to that, though, KSFR will kill me if I don't acknowledge that this is KSFR 101.1 FM and streaming live from ksfr.org. They desperately, well, not desperately overstating it, they need dollars, they need donations. So go to ksfr.org and click on the donate button, and think of it as your ticket to admission for some great programming. And some of that great programming is happening right now. And so we'll go back to Sarah And let's talk about water preservation policy. And Retake did a Zoom, what we call Zoominar with Melanie Stansberry and Norm Gaum and some other water experts. And, basically Norm informed me, I was surprised that the state really doesn't have any easy mechanism for managing its water. And that seemed like a bad idea, given that we're in a arid desert and a drought. What do you know about what Melanie was working on and what the state might need to do to better manage its own water?
Um, it's I will say this is a question where on the policy level, I'm less familiar, but I do understand some of the issues more broadly I think everybody in New Mexico is acutely aware of the fact that we have extremely limited water resources and increasing demand for those water resources. I think there's a little bit of a misuse of language sometimes that happens about like diminishing water resources. It's not that they're diminishing, it's that the demand is increasing, right? And that drought is happening, so replenishment of water resources sometimes is less frequent. But I think that water management is extremely complicated. I think maybe California and New Mexico compete for the complexity of our water rules and the layers of different governments from the past that have that we're looking at a lot of past doctrine on how water gets allocated, who it's allocated to, and legally it's extremely complex, which I think makes the practical management of water hard. Further, I think that like a lot of places in the West, we have sort of competing urban and rural forces at play around how that water gets utilized, as well as sort of varying degrees of sort of understanding about how water affects our ecology that then impacts our economy and sort of and our social circumstances, cultural circumstances. And so go for it. You got a question?
No, I was telling you about 1 minute left in the
Okay.
radio show, and then we'll shift over to the podcast.
Great. Anyway, it's a hard question to answer, but I will say that, I think part of the reason that we are an organization that advocates for regenerative agriculture is that I think it charts a path for agriculture to be more thoughtful about its water use. As one of the largest water users in the state, the agricultural community has a responsibility to be thinking about water in a smart way where we can be sharing equitably with everybody who needs it, sort of with the hope and expectation that other folks like urban dwellers show up to the conversation with the same kind of sharing mentality. So,
okay. Well, we're going to talk more about water issues in just a moment on the podcast, but we've got to close the show today. I want to thank Sarah for joining us. Give you one more chance to give the, what is Quivira's website address?
You can find us at quiviracoalition.org.
Okay, and we'll be back next week with a guest. I'm not sure who yet, but as always, I want to wish you well. Stay healthy, stay safe, and most of all, stay active. It's the only way we're going to fix this mess. So we'll be back next week, and thanks a lot. Okay, we're back on podcast, and we're talking with Sarah Wenzel Fisher, and we were just talking about water issues in the state. And one of the things I wondered about is it seems like the state has an inordinate amount of its agriculture devoted to more larger grazing operations and so forth, more industrial grazing and meat production in the form of, a lot of the food that we quote unquote food is food for cattle. And it's not always, a lot of that kind of produce is water intensive in its use. Can you comment on that? I mean, do we need to shift away from certain kinds of agricultural products in the state and look toward things that may use less water?
Um, I mean, the short answer to that question is yes. um, that the reality of increased climate variability and prolonged drought just mean that ways that we've practiced agriculture in the past are probably not going to be viable for very much longer into the future. And that said, I also want to maybe talk a little bit for a minute about how that's really complex. So you're right. I think that there's a lot of irrigated farmland in the state that is used for growing hay that feeds cows and dairies or feeds horses, or I don't know that it necessarily always goes to feed cattle on rangeland, but it becomes a really critical resource when we're in drought times to have hay available for folks who have ranching operations in the event that their pastures just are not producing the type of food that they do in other years. So I think that that's one layer of complexity. I think another layer of complexity touches on some of the other issues that Quivira addresses or works to address. I think succession of farms and ranches plays a role in sort of the fact that a lot of folks produce hay. So, producing hay, it's any type of farming is hard work, but I would say that, growing hay is got a routine to it. You irrigate it, you let it grow, then you can cut it with a tractor and bale it, stack it up, sell it. That there are there's a workforce that knows how to do that. They've got the machinery to do it. They've done it for a long time that way. And shifting to something else can be complicated and expensive. And a lot of operators, particularly here in New Mexico, we have some of the oldest farmers and ranchers in the country, according to the USDA census. If you've been doing that for a long time and you're at the end of your career, the
Right.
prospect of investing in a bunch of new equipment to say, start growing a lettuce or
Yeah.
some other type of grain may not be at the top of your priority list. And so I think that there's factors that make change harder than maybe apparent to the average person who is not engaged in farming. So I think that the short answer to your question is yes. I think agriculture is going to have to shift, but how that happens and sort of what are the pressure points that incentivize farmers to be able to do that, and what kind of support mechanisms are there to help them do that, are all going to be really critical to have it be a smooth transition rather than one that's really hard.
Yeah, well, and we're looking at transitions all over the place in this state, and for indeed throughout the world, because we haven't been living terribly sustainably, and it's going to require some shifts. I saw that you were a big supporter of Montanita, and I heard from you earlier that you were the membership person. In an irony, my wife was the membership person for the co-op before the Montanita in Santa Fe in the early 80s. And so what goes around comes around. But you're a big supporter of the co-ops, and Retake's been working with Working Families Party, Prosperity Works, Alliance for Local Economic Prosperity, the Sustainable Business Coalition, and some folks you may know. In fact, now I know you know from the Cooperative Catalyst, Robin Seidel and Sandra McCardle. And we're all trying to figure out ways in which we can advance legislation that could foster the development of co-ops, worker-owned co-ops, and so forth. How could co-ops be a factor in small farmer and small grazing operations, and is something going on in relation to that? I think I talked with Don Bustos about setting up a kind of trucking cooperative for farmers to move their foods around.
So it's a great question. And, you know, co-ops have been a strong part of agricultural history. Co-ops have always been sort of at the heart of, I think, transformative moments in agricultural history. And there's a lot of co-ops that exist in agriculture that sometimes don't get a lot of visibility because they are sort of producer co-ops. They're not like retail facing
Right.
co-ops. So I think that the short answer to your question is like co-ops absolutely have a role to play in helping to advance local food in the state of New Mexico.
Mhm.
And, you know, in addition to La Montanita Co-op providing support and the Cooperative Catalyst providing support, Rocky Mountain Farmers Union is another group that does a ton of cooperative development. And, you know, I think that there are a number of arenas where co-ops could be formed to really help create, say, like the infrastructure that we were talking about earlier. You know, maybe it's a producer owned processing plant that
Right.
is operated cooperatively. Um, uh, Cooperative distribution is huge. So, and I think, you know, co-ops are, they are great in theory, but they are they're a challenging business model because it requires a degree of commitment to collaboration and working together that I think that, you know, other types of business may not, but I think the rewards are also huge as well. So I'm excited that the Cooperative Catalyst exists, and I'm, you know, really grateful to the folks who are doing that work there. And I absolutely think that it's that co-ops have a future in helping us establish more stronger local and regional food systems.
Okay. Well, I'll probably keep keep you informed on that, because that's something that we're really interested in, and we're trying to find areas where co-ops would make the most sense to cultivate. And what we were focusing on, and this touched on something you just said about farmers who are approaching retirement and not interested in necessarily changing their business model towards the end of their careers, which I can certainly sympathize with. But there may be ways in which some of those farmers, as they're getting to the point of wanting to retire, that they can sell their businesses over to the workers. And I mean, there are models for how that can be done. I haven't seen it applied specifically for farming, but it might be an interesting way to go. Because from what I understand, most of those businesses can't get anything like what they think the value of their property or their business is by selling it. That they're sort of stuck and either hand it down to their children or are low on options. So, well, that's as much time as we actually have today. I wish we could go on. We had some more questions, but I actually have to go on to another Zoom that I'm late for, and the people are calling me on the phone. I could hear the phone ringing in the other room. So I'm going to have to say goodbye to Sarah, and I really want to thank you for giving us so much time today. And maybe I'll see you at the Green Chili Cheeseburger Smackdown in September.
I really hope so. Thanks so much for having me on today, Paul. I really appreciate it.
Okay, and thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.